So Matthew Piepenburg and myself, we're back for another MAM chat. Welcome, Matt.
Good to be here.
People haven't seen us for a while. That doesn't mean that we haven't been busy, but there's so much to talk about, Matt. So let's jump straight in. Now, as we both agree, I mean, we are at the end of an economic era and a major cycle. And the closer you get to the end of a cycle, the worse the news gets. But of course, governments, central banks, and other officials, they can't cope with bad news, so that they manipulate the news, or they publish just one part of the news and leave the bad part behind. So we're looking at here, no one has a clear perspective of what's happening here, because journalists never dig into anything. And that's what we try to do. And if you do actually look at the perspective, you realize that the media doesn't report anything. I mean, this is one of the areas which you are very interested in, Matt, and have written about recently. So let's just tell us about what actually you see with this perspective that is totally wrong today.
Now, it's a very interesting theme. You can hide the failures of the system by keeping context or perspective absent. It's a really interesting classic old trick throughout, especially difficult times in history. It's always the same cycles. It's always the same reactions. And part of that reaction is an intentional absence of context. And that's not an absence of bias, it's an absence of context. And I think I see it in six real obvious ways. And I'll talk about them real quickly because we've written about them and talked about them. But I think that it's important to keep it at 30,000 feet in mind for these conversations. And again, all of these things we both written about at length. So you can look at these from, our angle separately. But I think one of the clear themes when you're losing context, we see in the media, we see in politics, we see in all kinds of platforms is fudging the math. And again, we've written about how the math is fudged in so many ways. I mean, in CPI inflation data, looking at old metrics, old scales, we clearly see that inflation is underreported and misreported. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just an objective fact based on the weightings of energy, food, housing. It's a wonderful way of dialing down the reality of real felt inflation. Even things like unemployment in the US, we're bragging about 3.5, 3.6% inflation. That again is absolutely fictional fudge math. When you look at, guys like Nick Eberstadt have done a fantastic and better job than you and I, frankly, and looking at the labor force participation rate, looking at how the labor pool is. Labor force participation rate in the US is down significantly. That means there's over 10 to 12 million Americans who've just stopped looking for work. They're not applying for unemployment. They're misregarded. They're disregarded in the official employment statistics. So it's just fudge math. So that's one clear theme, which we could spend hours on, fudge math. The other big theme we see in this failure of context is kind of redefining the facts. Again, with inflation and unemployment, that's pretty obvious, but even the meaning of a recession, when you've got an inverted yield curve and you've got back-to-back negative GDP, when you've got the empire manufacturing at recessionary levels, when you've got leading indicators all screaming at recession, when the inverted yield curve starts to reinvert, those are pre-recessionary, recessionary issues. They're simply not making the mainstream media, not making the main dialogue on the main street. So people don't know that they're already in a recession or it's just off our bow. That has to be far more reported. So again, redefining the facts, fudging the math. The other theme I see is omitting the obvious, omitting just the elephant in the room. We talk about it over and over because it can't be repeated enough. When you've got 31 trillion in public debt in the US or over 300 trillion in global debt, these numbers are fatal and they're significant, and yet they're rarely discussed. They're not understood, except for those who try very hard to stay informed without trying to be sensational or negative. You've got to look at these debt numbers. You've got to look at the reality of the shift in the petrodollar. It's a seismic shift since 2022, February, this slow move away from the petrodollar. Even things like the casualty counts in the war in Ukraine, regardless of your view on the Ukraine, what it's doing to the male population of Ukraine, the military age population in Ukraine, the devastating effects of that, how that needs to be discussed openly rather than just looking at one good guy and one bad guy. These things, again, omitting the obvious. Food and energy prices in Europe, the inflation in Europe felt, not reported. These things need to be more than just kind of supplemental sideshow ideas. They need to be front and center. And again, if you take away enough of the warts, even a witch looks pretty. So the media and the politicians are doing a fantastic job of trying to ignore these obvious facts, omitting the obvious. That's the third kind of theme I see. The fourth thing I see is a desperate attempt to make good news out of bad news whenever they can, just like a losing general or a losing army. The propaganda back home is we're winning, we're winning, we're winning, when clearly the casualty counts are higher. And I think we see that, for example, in the Fed, central bank tightening. Look at Powell beating inflation. We've gone from 9.1% or 9% to 6.5% because we're fighting inflation with rising rates. We're tightening the balance sheet. Well, that ignores the context of the Fed balance sheet went from 800 billion to 9 trillion in a short amount of time. We reduced the Fed balance sheet by 300 billion last year. We also got the worst nominal returns in stocks and bonds since 1871. So as we're puffing our chest in the headlines about reducing the balance sheet by 2% and causing massive destruction, it's a dent, it's a hiccup, given that we've raised the balance sheet by trillions over the years. It's the same thing with the M2 money supply right now. Everyone's saying, look, M2 money supply has come down by 500 billion. We're slowing down that inflationary force. What the headlines and the pundits are ignoring is the M2 money supply went up by 14 trillion since 2000. So a 500 billion reduction in M2 money supply is an absolute hiccup. And again, this is just, again, kind of trying desperately to find good news. And again, I see that in so many ways. And the other theme is the absence or censoring of alternative opinion. That's something I remember the days even younger and looking back when you saw like William Buckley having a debate with Gore Vidal. Two very different opinions, left and right, but two very smart opinions. And it was an exciting time to see this open exchange of extremely informed individuals with very different opinions. You and I have very strong opinions. We offer a contrarian opinion based on what we consider to be objective facts, but our opinions are kind of hidden, and the mainstream media just flows past these obvious facts. And so I miss the days of the Buckley, Gore Vidal type mentality, that open curiosity, that courage to speak differently. That's absent today. We see that, I think, really these kind of other kind of example of this lack of debate, or you're talking about the two most obvious examples I think coming up modern are central bank digital currencies, the IMF, the BIS, now the Fed, all leading this propaganda argument that CBDCs are fantastic, efficient payment systems. They only want to show you the warm and fuzzy part. They're ignoring the clear and obvious issue, debatable issue, of how central bank digital currencies are a classic control mechanism over the population, a monitoring and a control mechanism that at least should be debated. It's omitted from the dialogue, in the public mainstream dialogue. It's omitted from politics. It's generally omitted. The Zelensky kind of George Washington myth, that is one view, that he's a freedom fighter, and there's plenty to be said to support that view, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he's anything but, and we've talked about that too. Again, it's not trying to take a side, but that omission of perspective, that omission of two-sided arguments is really a trend. And I think finally, and most importantly, the last issue here is, fear and war as political tools. You can use them as a distraction. It's an Ablenkung. It's a way to keep the masses not focused on money supply expansion, increasing debt levels, and really a trend towards inflation. When the money supply expands, the central bankers expand the money supply, price supply, in supply chains, all those other excuses, it's not really the issue. The real issue, the real elephant in the room is money supply expansion. That's why we have inflation. Should be debated. All these things are omitted. So this fear and war theme, Egon, comes to my question to you, because, with all these different forms of kind of keeping things out of context, right now there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of war, there's a lot of drum beats, and there's even more concern about how this war can escalate. That has led to a lot of concern about not only the gold price, but where to store gold, Egon, in what jurisdictions, what parts of the world are safe when the whole world feels unsafe, especially under this kind of thundercloud of nuclear risk. I would love you to talk about that for not just ourselves, but for our listeners, to kind of, what are your thoughts on not just the gold price, which is a lengthy discussion, but the safest and best way to still hold gold, from where you founded Matterhorn decades ago to where we are today? How has your thoughts changed or evolved given the last 2 years?
Well, thank you, Matt. Well, the interesting thing is that for more than 20 years, 25 years, I mean, I haven't changed my mind on anything. You could say that I'm stubborn and I'm not paying attention to what is actually happening. But, the trend to me was clear 25 years ago, or if not longer. And now it's all happening. Okay, we went into gold early because we knew that the development was going to be what it is now. And at the end of an era, everything that goes
can go bad goes bad, and a lot of things have been swept under the carpet, come out, and we will see that in company reports in coming years. That a lot of losses have been hid and hidden, and people have actually haven't got the balance sheets that they're reporting at all. So to me, it's been very clear that this trend, I mean, it's frightening, and all the bad news that you have been telling us about that nobody understands, and therefore stock markets are still not far from the highs, because people believe that good news will never end. But adding to then the fact that we are going to have a massive financial and economic crash in the world, that's what you and I have been predicting for years. Cycles don't end quickly. It's a process. It's not just one event. As Hemingway says, and we've quoted a couple of times, it's first gradually and then suddenly, and the suddenly is coming nearer. And it's not. So we have the financial cycle, which is coming to an end, and that's going to be a horrible implosion of asset values and of debt. Add to that, and that's also part of the end of an era. Add to that the war cycle. It was always clear that I'm not a war cycle specialist, but I've studied enough to know that around the 2015 war period, the war cycle was starting properly, and that's what we're seeing now. So you get the maximum of bad news, and of course it would be hard enough for the world to cope with the financial news. Add to that the war, and of course war is an unknown factor, because we don't know that at this point it's a local war in Ukraine and around Ukraine, if you want. But with all the major world powers now involved, the US, this is obviously a fight between US and Russia, and then you add China to that, and North Korea, and this war is not going to end quickly. In my view, US has no chance against those powers, and they know that. So they're not going to do anything silly, in my view. Nor is Russia going to go west, as people talk about, because Russia's never gone west. Russia's never invaded Europe. They pushed the Germans back. They went into Finland a bit, etc. But and they've been into Eastern Europe, but they've never been into Western Europe. And that is not. They have no intention of doing that. So these are all the things, Matt, that we have to take into account when we look at wealth preservation, of course. Now, so first of all, you preserve wealth against the financial risks, which are enormous. People don't realize that, because all the facts that you just reported, nobody's aware of. Nobody's aware of the massive risks that we're looking at. No, and therefore, still only 0.5% of world financial assets are invested in gold, which is ridiculous. You and I on this channel and in articles are preaching to the converted, but 99.5% have, and that includes major institutions, of course, pension funds, etc. They have no interest in gold. They don't understand it. They don't understand the significance, in spite of the fact that gold has been the best performing asset in this century. Mm-hmm. So we believe that gold will continue the trend, which is really a trend of a destruction of paper money. So paper money has lost 80% or so this century, lost 97, 99% since 71, and that's going to accelerate now. That's why holding physical gold and a bit of silver outside a fragile banking system is absolutely essential. Now, we think that the jurisdictions is getting more difficult, Matt, as we know. It's more difficult because there's no safe country anymore. Every country has problems. But we've come to the conclusion in our research at MAM that still we believe, in spite of what's happening in Europe, in spite of the war, and we are not prejudiced, we can store gold in any country in the world for clients. So that's not the point. The point is that from the point of view of history, tradition, politics, financial safety, economic performance, Switzerland and crime levels, very important. For example, Switzerland has the lowest crime in Europe and lowest crime in the world, except for a few Middle East countries. So this is a very, very safe country, and therefore, there's nothing that compares. I would say the second one would be Singapore, but that's a young country. It's in Asia, and we store gold there too. But I would say that his history counts a lot, and tradition, and Switzerland beats any country in that respect. So this is what people should think about now. But also, things will change. This is a dynamic situation. It can develop in any direction, and we've got to be prepared to advise investors that you shouldn't have gold in Switzerland anymore. You should have it in in another country, depending on what's happening in the world. And of course, this is your wealth preservation asset should be managed by a professional manager who understands what's happening in the world, both politically, financially, as well as from the point of view of safety. And so therefore, we maybe at some point we will advise clients that you need to move to that country or that country. And of course, only a professional manager can do that today, because individuals can't shift gold around the world. It's getting harder and harder to transport gold. So therefore, you need somebody to actually do it for you, as somebody who's professional. We still believe that a vault, for example, our Mountain Vault, which is the biggest private gold vault in the world, and nuclear bomb proof, is the safest. But we are prepared. If something happens in Europe when we change our mind, then we are prepared to tell clients that, and we will tell them that we should move the gold to another place. I don't think people should store gold in their home country, because you have to have gold in a safe jurisdiction which you can flee to, and if you have it in your home country, then it's not a wealth preservation asset to the same extent as if you actually have it somewhere else. And so there's so many factors to take into account. I believe that we've done this for 20 years, and we started it for our own gold, and now we are also helping others. So we definitely have skin in the game, and we're thinking about this every day. And we wish that more people start worrying about the fact that both economically, financially, in the world, they're going to lose a lot of money on many of their bubble assets, and even on their cash, which will continue to decline. And then we have the geopolitical situation, which is also people obviously worry about. But as I said, at this point, for people who are not living in Europe, life goes on as normal in Europe, except for all the problems that Matt has outlined in the economy and migration that we have everywhere, etc. But there's nothing to worry about at this point in Europe, and therefore we still believe that this is a good place. But remember that you have to be nimble here. And so that's why we are on constant watch here, and you are the one who's studying as much as I am the financial and economic situation in the world. And what's your final word on that?
Well, there's no way to sugarcoat it, but all the points you've made and that I made prior are about the importance of perspective and context, not bias, but conviction. It's not about selling a book or selling a sensational theme. It's about looking at the facts, looking at the context of those facts, and being nimble, and being objective. We can and do put gold anywhere in the world, and we still believe in this jurisdiction, despite realistic issues, including Swiss neutrality changes and the war in the Ukraine. But again, with an objective conviction as opposed to a personal bias, these things have to be discussed, debated, and flexibly looked at, which we do every week. We talk about this all the time. And again, your point is well made. It's still the best option based on all the facts we look at, but it doesn't mean we're not flexible, ultimately solving problems and coming up with solutions for our clients. It's not a sales pitch, it's just creating a solution. And that's what we have been doing for 20 plus years. And that includes jurisdiction. But being someone who goes back and forth between Europe and the US and South America, we've looked at every part of the world, including Asia. We still think objectively that Switzerland is the best jurisdiction for a number of reasons. And gold obviously solves the problem for currency risk and for wealth preservation. So this is something Rick Rule said recently about silver, but it's true about gold too. It rewards infrequently but extravagantly. If you're thinking contextually, longer term, intelligently about wealth preservation, it's a no-brainer. It's not a bias, it's history in context with failing money. And so it's not just the way you protect your money, it's where you protect. And we are thinking about that constantly.
Yes, and then coming back to Switzerland, you know, the most countries now have confiscated assets of Russian assets, for example. But Switzerland has said, the government said just a week ago that we have, according to our constitution, we have no right to confiscate an individual's money, even if it's in our banks, etc. And that, you know, and that means common sense to you and me. Why should a country be allowed to just grab money from anywhere just because they don't like the country or the person that's holding it? That's not the rule of law, and that is therefore also clearly stated by the Swiss government that the constitution will not allow that. So it is, the principles here in Switzerland are sounder than in most countries. And of course, it's reflected in, you know, virtually no deficits, very low debt, a very strong currency. You know, the dollar has lost 80% against the Swiss franc since '71. So you know, we are, this is still, and I've lived in many countries, and I have 2 passports, Swiss and Swedish, and lived in America and lived in England, etc. So you know, to me, this is the best country in the world politically. But it might change, so we are always on the lookout, always to help our investors and our clients.
Absolutely.
Matt, this was a useful discussion, and we will be back soon again. So thank you, Matt, and thank you to our audience, and bye from us.
Okay, Egon, talk soon.
Bye-bye.